Peasant fed a lame horse all winter. 1 year later, a sound brought him to tears. The bitter wind howled across the snow-covered fields, carrying with it the weight of another lonely winter morning. John Matthews stood at his farmhouse window, his weathered hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee, watching as the first light of dawn painted the white landscape in shades of pink and gold. The solitude that had been his constant companion since Sarah's departure years ago pressed heavily upon his shoulders, but he had learned to find comfort in the simple routine of caring for his modest farm. If this story caught your interest, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give it a like. Let us know which city you're watching from. Stay with us. His daily tasks were as predictable as the sunrise, feeding the few remaining animals in his stable, chopping wood to keep the fire burning, and ensuring his food stores would last through the harshest months. The isolation might have broken a weaker man, but John had grown accustomed to the rhythm of rural life, finding solace in the quiet moments between tasks. As he prepared to venture out for his morning wood-gathering routine, something caught his eye, an unusual, dark shape against the pristine white snow near his property's fence line. His heart quickened as he grabbed his thick winter coat and headed outside, the frozen air biting at his exposed skin. Drawing closer, the shape took form. A magnificent black horse lay collapsed in the snow, its powerful body trembling from exhaustion and cold. The animal's coat, usually sleek and proud, was matted with snow and dirt. One of its legs was swollen, and its labored breathing created small clouds in the frigid air. John's practical nature warred with his compassion. Taking in another mouth to feed during such a harsh winter would strain his already limited resources. Yet, as he knelt beside the struggling creature, looking into its intelligent eyes that seemed to hold untold stories, he knew he couldn't leave it to perish in the cold. "Easy there, friend," he murmured, his voice gentle as he reached for the horse. The animal's ears twitched at his words, but it made no attempt to flee. Carefully, John offered a handful of dry hay from his pocket, a habit he'd never broken from his days of caring for multiple horses. The creature's nostrils flared, testing his scent before accepting the offering with surprising eagerness. With patience born from years of working with animals, John managed to loop a rope around the horse's neck. The process of guiding it to the stable was slow and careful, each step measured to avoid further injury to the animal's swollen leg. Inside the warm shelter, he prepared a soft bed of straw and covered the horse with thick blankets, hoping to combat the bone-deep chill that had settled into its powerful frame. As days passed, John found himself drawn into a new routine. Between his regular chores, he spent hours tending to the mysterious stallion's injuries, ensuring it had fresh water and plenty of feed. The horse, initially wary and defensive, gradually began to respond to his care. There was something different about this animal, a noble bearing that spoke of careful breeding and training. John named him Thunder, inspired by the latent power he sensed in the horse's muscular frame. As Thunder's strength returned, his true nature began to emerge, proud yet gentle, spirited but intelligent. The way he carried himself, even injured, suggested a background far removed from the simple farm life he now shared with John. Questions nagged at the farmer's mind as he watched Thunder's recovery. Had the horse escaped from some wealthy estate? Or had it been abandoned when it no longer served its purpose? The mystery of Thunder's origins deepened when John noticed the horse's peculiar behavior during the quiet evening hours. Every night, as the wind died down and the forest fell into its winter silence, Thunder would position himself near the stable door, his gaze fixed intently on the tree line. Sometimes he would release soft nickering sounds, as if calling out to unseen companions. Even John's old sheepdog, Spot, seemed to sense something unusual, pacing restlessly around the barn and barking at shadows. As John settled into his bed that night, the wind whistling through the eaves of his old farmhouse, he couldn't shake the feeling that Thunder's appearance had set something in motion. something that would change the quiet predictability of his solitary life forever. Little did he know, this was just the beginning of a story that would challenge everything he thought he knew about loyalty, freedom, and the unexpected bonds that can form between the most unlikely of companions. As winter tightened its grip on the countryside, John began to notice strange occurrences around his farm. Fresh tracks appeared in the snow near the stable. Not just any tracks, but those of other horses. These mysterious prints always led to the edge of the forest before vanishing among the dense trees, as if their makers had disappeared into thin air. Thunder's behavior became increasingly peculiar during the twilight hours. His ears would prick forward at the slightest sound from the forest, and his powerful frame would tense with anticipation. Sometimes, in the dead of night, John would wake to the sound of distant whinnying carried on the winter wind, and Thunder's answering calls would echo through the stable. Spot, typically a calm and steady companion, had taken to spending long hours watching the tree line, his hackles raised at unseen presences. The old sheepdog's unusual behavior only served to heighten John's growing suspicion that there was more to Thunder's story than a simple case of a lost horse. One particularly cold evening, as John was completing his final barn check, he noticed Thunder standing completely still, his gaze fixed on something beyond the property line. Following the horse's line of sight, John caught a fleeting glimpse of movement among the trees, dark shapes shifting in the shadows, gone so quickly he might have imagined them. "What secrets are you keeping, old boy?" John murmured, running a calloused hand along Thunder's muscular neck. The horse turned to look at him, those intelligent eyes seeming to hold answers just out of reach. There was something almost human in the way Thunder regarded him, as if weighing how much to reveal. During his rare trips into town for supplies, John began to pay closer attention to the local gossip. He caught fragments of conversations about wild horses seen in the region, though most dismissed these sightings as tall tales born of too much time alone in the wilderness. Yet John couldn't shake the feeling that these stories might hold a kernel of truth. Mrs. Henderson, who ran the general store, mentioned that her cousin had spotted a group of horses running free in the valley, moving like shadows through the morning mist. "Not just any horses," she'd said, lowering her voice conspiratorially, "but the finest specimens you've ever seen. Proud and strong, like they belonged to nobility." The mystery deepened when John discovered an old photograph in a dusty album showing a magnificent black stallion leading a group of horses across a snow-covered field. The image, yellowed with age, had been taken by his late wife Sarah, who had always been fascinated by the local legends of wild horses that roamed the mountains. As John studied the photograph, he noticed striking similarities between the stallion in the picture and Thunder. The same proud bearing, the same intelligent eyes, even the same distinctive white marking on the foreleg. Could there be a connection? The possibility sent his mind racing with questions. That night, a fierce storm swept across the valley, rattling the windows of the old farmhouse and howling like a wild thing. John tossed and turned in his bed, troubled by unsettling dreams of horses running through moonlit forests. He woke suddenly, his heart pounding, though he couldn't say what had disturbed his sleep. Something felt wrong. The storm had died down to a gentle snowfall, but an unusual silence hung over the farm. Even Spot, usually vocal during storms, was eerily quiet. John threw on his coat and boots, grabbing a lantern before heading out to check on the animals. As he approached the stable, the beam of his lantern revealed fresh tracks in the newly fallen snow, multiple sets of hoofprints surrounding the building. His pace quickened as he reached for the stable door, his breath catching in his throat. The sight that greeted him confirmed his worst fears. Thunder's stall was empty. The blanket that had covered the horse lay abandoned on the straw-covered floor, and the door showed no signs of forced entry. It was as if Thunder had simply walked out into the night. But he hadn't gone alone. The numerous tracks in the snow told a different story, one that spoke of a midnight gathering and a decision that would change everything. Without hesitation, John grabbed his warmest coat and a rope, determined to follow the tracks before the falling snow could erase them completely. As he set out into the darkness, Spot at his heels, he couldn't help but wonder if he was about to discover the truth behind Thunder's mysterious past, and perhaps understand why fate had brought this remarkable horse into his life in the first place. The winter night enveloped John as he pressed forward through the deepening snow, following the maze of hoofprints that led away from his farm. His lantern cast a weak glow against the darkness, barely illuminating the path ahead. Spot stayed close to his heels, occasionally whining at sounds that human ears couldn't detect. The tracks led them down into a sheltered valley John knew well, a place where the wind-carved rocks created natural barriers against the harsh mountain weather. As they descended, the snowfall began to ease, and an ethereal silence settled over the landscape. The only sound was the crunch of John's boots in the fresh powder and his own labored breathing. Suddenly, Spot froze, his ears perking forward. John raised his lantern higher, and his heart skipped a beat at what he saw. There, in the center of the valley, stood Thunder. But he wasn't alone. Surrounding him were several other horses, their coats gleaming in the dim light, their breath creating clouds of vapor in the cold air. These weren't ordinary farm horses. They moved with a grace that spoke of wildness and freedom, their muscles rippling beneath winter-thick coats. They were magnificent creatures, proud and untamed, exactly like the ones from Sarah's old photograph. John counted at least 8 of them, forming a loose circle around Thunder. As John watched, transfixed, a peculiar scene unfolded. Thunder stepped forward to meet a particularly striking mare, their noses touching in what seemed like recognition. The other horses moved restlessly, pawing at the snow and tossing their heads, creating a dance of shadows in the lantern light. "Thunder!" John called softly, not wanting to startle the horses. His voice carried clearly in the still night air. Thunder's head snapped up at the sound, and for a moment John saw uncertainty in the horse's stance. The stallion looked between John and the wild herd, caught between two worlds. The wild horses shifted nervously at John's presence, but didn't flee. Instead, they seemed to be waiting, watching the interaction between Thunder and the human who had cared for him. John recognized the intelligence in their eyes, the same knowing look he'd seen in Thunder's gaze so many times before. A memory stirred in John's mind, something Sarah had told him years ago about the legends of these mountains. She'd spoken of horses that weren't quite like others, creatures that carried ancient wisdom in their blood. At the time, he'd dismissed it as just another local tale, but now, standing in this moonlit valley, those stories took on new meaning. Thunder took a step toward John, then hesitated, looking back at the wild herd. The mare who had greeted him nickered softly, as if encouraging him to make a choice. The moment was charged with tension, like a thread pulled taut between past and present, between domestication and freedom. John understood then that he was witnessing something few humans ever had, a gathering of the legendary wild horses of the valley. Thunder's mysterious behavior, the tracks in the snow, the stories he'd heard in town, it all made sense now. These weren't just escaped farm horses. They were something else entirely, something that belonged to the wilderness itself. As he stood there, the weight of the decision before him became clear. He could try to lead Thunder back to the stable, back to the safety and comfort of domestic life. Or he could let him choose his own path, even if that meant watching him disappear into the night with his wild kin. The mare stepped closer to Thunder, her movement graceful and deliberate. In the dim light, John could see a resemblance between them. The same proud arch of the neck, the same intelligent eyes. Could she be family? Had Thunder once been part of this wild herd before circumstance brought him to John's farm? The other horses began to move, their hooves making barely a sound in the fresh snow. They circled around Thunder and the mare, creating a living barrier between the domestic world John represented and the freedom of the wilderness they embodied. Their movements were synchronized, almost ritualistic, as if they were performing an ancient ceremony of acceptance or rejection. Thunder remained motionless, his dark coat gleaming in the lantern light, his eyes moving between John and the herd. The choice before him seemed to reflect a deeper truth about the nature of freedom and belonging. In that moment, standing in the snow-filled valley under a star-strewn sky, John realized that sometimes love means being willing to let go. Before John could make any decision, the wild horses suddenly tensed, their ears pricking forward in unison. A distant sound carried on the wind, voices, and the crunch of approaching footsteps through snow. The wild herd immediately began to retreat, melting into the shadows of the surrounding forest with an almost supernatural grace. Thunder's reaction surprised John. Instead of following the herd, the black stallion moved closer to him, positioning himself between John and the direction of the approaching sounds. It was a protective gesture that spoke volumes about the bond they had formed during their time together. The voices grew clearer, and John could make out at least 3 different people approaching. Thunder's ears flattened against his head, and his muscles tensed beneath his sleek coat. John placed a reassuring hand on the horse's neck, feeling the rapid pulse beneath his palm. "I'm telling you, I saw them heading this way," a gruff voice carried through the darkness. "That black stallion has to be around here somewhere. Do you know how much a horse like that is worth?" John's heart raced as he realized the implications. These weren't casual travelers. They were looking specifically for Thunder. The horse's obvious breeding and noble bearing suddenly made more sense. Was this why he had been injured and alone when John found him? Had he been running from something or someone? Making a quick decision, John extinguished his lantern and led Thunder behind a large rock formation. Spot followed silently, seeming to understand the need for stealth. From their hiding place, they could see 3 figures emerge into the moonlit valley, carrying powerful flashlights that swept across the snow. "Look at all these tracks," one of them said, kneeling to examine the ground. "There must be a whole herd of them out here, but that black stallion is the one we want." The boss was clear about that. Thunder stood perfectly still beside John, but his whole body thrummed with tension. The mare who had greeted Thunder earlier appeared briefly at the forest's edge, watching the scene unfold before disappearing again into the darkness. John realized she was waiting to see what would happen. The searchers continued to scan the valley, their lights cutting through the darkness. "We've been tracking that horse for months," the gruff voice continued. "Ever since he escaped during transport. Pure Spanish bloodline, worth a fortune to the right buyer." The pieces of the puzzle were finally falling into place in John's mind. Thunder wasn't just any lost horse. He was a valuable prize, perhaps stolen or purchased under questionable circumstances. His escape and subsequent injury must have occurred during his bid for freedom. As the searchers moved closer to their hiding place, John felt Thunder's muscles bunch beneath his hand, ready to bolt. But the horse remained steady, trusting John to protect him just as John had trusted Thunder's intelligence and nobility all these months. The wild mare appeared again, this time accompanied by 2 other horses. They emerged from the forest on the opposite side of the valley, their hooves drumming against the frozen ground. The searchers' lights immediately swung in that direction. "There they are!" one of them shouted, and the 3 men took off across the valley, following what they thought was their quarry. But John could see that the black horse they were chasing wasn't Thunder. It was another member of the wild herd, leading them away from where Thunder and John hid. The intelligence and coordination of the wild horses left John awestruck. They were protecting one of their own, creating a diversion to keep Thunder safe. It was further proof that these weren't ordinary horses. They possessed an awareness and loyalty that went beyond simple herd instinct. As the sounds of pursuit faded into the distance, Thunder turned to look at John, their eyes meeting in the darkness. The horse's gaze held a question, and John knew that the moment of choice had arrived. The wild herd had proved they would protect Thunder, but they were also offering him the freedom to choose his own path. John ran his hand along Thunder's strong neck one last time, feeling the powerful muscles beneath the winter-thick coat. In the distance, the wild mare's call echoed through the valley, a reminder of the life that awaited Thunder if he chose to claim it. The decision that John had to make wasn't just about keeping or losing a horse. It was about recognizing and honoring the true nature of the magnificent creature that fate had brought into his life. The first hints of dawn were beginning to paint the eastern sky when John finally led Thunder back to the stable. The night's events had left him with much to contemplate, and he knew that the coming days would require careful consideration of what he had witnessed in the valley. Thunder walked beside him willingly, but there was a new awareness in his stride, as if the encounter with the wild herd had awakened something dormant within him. The horse's occasional glances toward the forest spoke of a growing internal conflict, a battle between his loyalty to John and the call of his true nature. Back at the farm, John took extra care settling Thunder into his stall, adding fresh straw and making sure he had plenty of water and feed. As he worked, he couldn't shake the image of the wild horses moving through the moonlit valley, their coordinated efforts to protect one of their own, displaying an intelligence that challenged everything he thought he knew about these creatures. "You're quite special, aren't you?" John murmured, watching as Thunder's ears swiveled to catch his words. Those weren't just any horses out there tonight. He thought about Sarah's old stories, the ones he had dismissed as mere folklore. How many times had she tried to tell him about the mysterious wild horses of the valley? How many times had he smiled indulgently, treating her words as nothing more than charming local legends? The following days brought new changes to the farm's routine. John noticed that Thunder spent more time at the fence line, his gaze fixed on the distant forest. The wild mare would sometimes appear at the tree line at dusk, her presence a silent reminder of the choice that Thunder would eventually have to make. During his trips to town for supplies, John began to hear more whispers about the mysterious visitors who had been asking questions about a valuable black stallion. Their description of the horse matched Thunder perfectly, and John found himself growing increasingly protective of his four-legged friend. One afternoon, while John was repairing a section of fence, he spotted an expensive black car driving slowly past his property. The occupants seemed to be studying his farm with particular interest, and he noticed them paying special attention to the stable where Thunder was kept. The sight sent a chill down his spine, despite the warm spring sun. That evening, as he sat in his kitchen drinking coffee, John pulled out Sarah's old photo album. He found himself studying the yellowed photographs of the wild horses she had managed to capture on film. One image in particular caught his attention. It showed the same mare he had seen in the valley, though the photo must have been taken years ago. She hadn't aged a day, which seemed impossible, yet there she was, exactly as she appeared now. Thunder's nervous nickering drew John outside. The black stallion was acting agitated, pacing in his enclosure and tossing his head. When John approached, he could feel the tension radiating from the horse. Something was wrong. Even Spot was on edge, growling softly at shadows that seemed to move among the trees. As night fell, John decided to sleep in the stable loft, unwilling to leave Thunder alone. He made a comfortable nest in the hay and settled in with an old blanket, Spot curled up beside him. The night was unusually quiet, with only the occasional hoot of an owl breaking the silence. In the darkest hours before dawn, John was awakened by the sound of vehicles approaching. Through a gap in the stable walls, he could see headlights moving along the distant road, heading toward his farm. Thunder shifted restlessly below, and John could hear the soft drumming of hooves from the direction of the forest. The wild herd was nearby, their presence both a comfort and a warning. John knew that the moment of truth had arrived. He would have to decide whether to protect Thunder from those who claimed ownership of him, or to let nature take its course and allow the horse to follow his true destiny with the wild herd. As he watched the approaching lights, John remembered something Sarah used to say about the wild horses. They're not meant to be owned, John. They belong to the mountains, to the wind, to something older than our understanding. At the time, he hadn't grasped the full meaning of her words. Now, watching Thunder's powerful form in the pre-dawn darkness, he finally understood what she had been trying to tell him. The approaching vehicles came to a stop just outside the farm's main gate. John's heart pounded as he watched three men emerge from an expensive SUV, their flashlight beams cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. He recognized their voices from the valley encounter, but now there was no place to hide. Thunder stood alert in his stall, his ears pricked forward, every muscle tense. Through the gaps in the stable walls, John could see more shapes moving in the forest. The wild herd was close, watching and waiting. The mare's distinct silhouette was visible among the trees, her presence a silent reminder of Thunder's true heritage. "We know the horse is here," a commanding voice called out. "We have documentation proving ownership. There's no need to make this difficult." The words were polite, but the underlying threat was clear. John descended from the loft, patting Thunder's neck reassuringly as he passed. Spot followed close behind, his usual friendly demeanor replaced by watchful alertness. As John stepped out of the stable, he could see the men clearly in the growing light of dawn, expensive suits beneath their winter coats, totally out of place in this rural setting. The leader of the group stepped forward, holding out a folder. "Mr. Matthews, I presume? I'm Richard Harrison from Elite Equestrian Enterprises. We've been searching for this horse for months. He's an extremely valuable purebred Spanish stallion who was being transported to our breeding facility when he escaped." John accepted the folder, thumbing through legal documents and photographs. Everything appeared legitimate on the surface, but something felt wrong. The photos showed Thunder in an elaborate stable, wearing expensive tack, but his eyes in the images looked dull, nothing like the spirited, intelligent gaze John had come to know. "He was injured when I found him," John said carefully, watching their reactions. "Half frozen in the snow. Would have perished if I hadn't taken him in." Harrison's smile didn't reach his eyes. "And we're grateful for your care, Mr. Matthews. We'll be happy to compensate you for your expenses. But now it's time for him to return to where he belongs." A soft, nickering sound drew everyone's attention to the forest's edge. The wild mare had emerged from the trees, standing proud and fearless in the growing light. Other horses appeared beside her, their coats gleaming with an almost ethereal quality in the dawn light. The men stared in amazement at the gathering herd. "Well, what do we have here?" Harrison muttered, his eyes gleaming with interest. "Looks like we might have stumbled onto something even more valuable than our missing stallion." Thunder's powerful neigh rang out from the stable, answered immediately by the mare and the rest of the herd. The sound seemed to vibrate through the very ground beneath their feet, carrying with it something ancient and wild that made the men step back involuntarily. "The horse doesn't belong to anyone," John said firmly, finding strength in the presence of the wild herd. "He's not meant for breeding programs or show rings. Look at him, really look at him. He's part of something bigger than your business ventures." Harrison's pleasant facade cracked slightly. "That horse represents years of careful breeding and a significant financial investment. We have legal ownership, Mr. Matthews. Don't force us to involve the authorities." But even as he spoke, more horses emerged from the forest, forming a semicircle behind the mare. Their presence seemed to change the very atmosphere, filling it with an energy that was almost palpable. John noticed that Harrison and his men kept glancing nervously at the wild horses, clearly unsettled by their unusual behavior. Thunder moved restlessly in his stall, his hooves drumming against the floor. The sound merged with a growing rumble of hooves from the wild herd, creating a rhythm that seemed to pulse through the early morning air. It was as if the very spirit of the mountains was awakening, channeled through these magnificent creatures. John stood his ground between the men and the stable, understanding that this moment was about more than just the ownership of a single horse. It was about the right to freedom, about protecting something ancient and mysterious that still existed in these mountains, something that Sarah had understood all those years ago. The standoff continued as the sun began to rise over the mountain peaks, casting long shadows across the snow-covered ground. The wild herd remained in position, their presence creating an invisible barrier between Harrison's group and the stable where Thunder waited. "You don't understand what you're dealing with," John said, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "These horses, they're different. They're not meant to be owned or controlled." Sarah knew it, and now I understand why she spent so much time documenting their existence. Harrison's expression shifted from irritation to curiosity. Sarah Matthews, the photographer. When John nodded, a look of recognition crossed Harrison's face. "I remember those photographs. They caused quite a stir in certain circles. Many people believed they were manipulated or staged. No one could accept that such horses existed." The wild mare stepped forward, her movements graceful and deliberate. In the growing light, her coat seemed to shimmer with an otherworldly quality. Harrison and his men watched, transfixed, as she approached closer than any wild horse should dare. "Extraordinary," Harrison breathed, his previous arrogance replaced by genuine wonder. The legends about these mountains, could they actually be true? He turned to John with new respect in his eyes. "Your wife's photographs, they weren't just documentation, were they? She was trying to protect them." Thunder's powerful neigh interrupted the moment. He had managed to unlock his stall door, something John had seen him do before but had never quite believed. And now stood in the stable doorway. His black coat gleamed in the morning sun, and his eyes held an intelligence that was impossible to deny. The wild mare called to him, and Thunder responded, but he didn't immediately run to join the herd. Instead, he walked calmly to stand beside John, positioning himself between his human friend and Harrison's group. The gesture was clear. He was choosing his own path. "I've spent my entire career working with horses," Harrison said slowly, "but I've never seen anything like this. The way they move, the way they interact. It's almost as if..." He trailed off, seemingly unable to put into words what they were all witnessing. One of Harrison's men stepped forward, reaching for Thunder's reins, but the horse deftly sidestepped, showing remarkable awareness. The wild herd responded immediately, moving closer in perfect synchronization, their hooves making no sound despite the frozen ground. "Mr. Harrison," John said, placing a hand on Thunder's neck, "you have your documentation and your legal claims, but look around you. There's something here that goes beyond paperwork and ownership rights. These horses are guardians of something ancient, something that deserves to be protected." The morning light had fully illuminated the scene now, and with it came a startling revelation. The wild horses' coats seemed to hold the very essence of dawn within them, their eyes reflecting wisdom that spoke of centuries rather than years. Even Harrison, with all his experience, could not deny the extraordinary nature of what he was witnessing. "The local tribes have stories," John continued, remembering tales Sarah had collected during her research. "They speak of spirit horses that protect these mountains, keeping ancient secrets and maintaining balance. I never believed them until now. But Sarah, she understood. She tried to tell me, but I wasn't ready to listen." Thunder stood proudly beside John, his presence a bridge between two worlds, the domestic and the wild, the ordinary and the extraordinary. The wild mare approached them, touching her nose to Thunder's in a gesture of acceptance and recognition. Harrison watched this interaction with growing understanding. His hands, which had been clutching the ownership documents, slowly lowered to his sides. The papers that had seemed so important moments ago now felt insignificant in the face of what they were witnessing. The wild herd began to move in a circle around them, their movements creating patterns that seemed to carry meaning beyond human understanding. It was a display of something primordial, a reminder that some things in this world could not be owned or contained by human conventions. The morning sun had fully risen, casting a golden glow over the extraordinary scene unfolding at John's farm. The wild horses continued their mesmerizing circular movement, their hooves creating patterns in the fresh snow. Harrison and his men stood transfixed, their original purpose seemingly forgotten in the face of something far more significant than a legal claim to ownership. "I remember now," Harrison said softly, his eyes never leaving the dancing horses. "Years ago, there was a story about a special bloodline in these mountains. Horses that couldn't be captured or tamed, that seemed to possess unusual intelligence. Most people dismissed it as folklore, but there were some who believed." He pulled another document from his briefcase, this one old and worn. This report was filed by the first expedition that tried to locate these horses, dating back almost 50 years. They described creatures that moved like shadows through the mountains, that seemed to communicate with each other in ways that defied explanation. John listened intently, remembering Sarah's passionate belief in these legends. She had spent countless hours tracking the wild herd, earning their trust bit by bit, documenting their existence not for fame or profit, but to protect their secret. Now he understood why she had been so protective of her photographs, why she had never published them despite numerous offers. Thunder stood quietly beside John, his presence a living bridge between the world of humans and the mysteries of the wild herd. The mare approached them again, and this time John noticed something he hadn't before, a small white marking on her chest, exactly matching one in Sarah's oldest photographs. It seemed impossible, yet there it was. "They don't age like normal horses, do they?" John asked, though it wasn't really a question. "Sarah's photographs from 20 years ago, that same mare looks exactly the same now." Harrison shook his head in wonder. "The indigenous people of these mountains have stories about guardian spirits that take the form of horses. They say these creatures protect sacred places and keep ancient knowledge safe from those who would misuse it. We always thought it was just mythology, but now the wild herd's movement had created a perfect circle in the snow, with Thunder, John, and the mare at its center. The other horses moved with fluid grace, their coats shimmering with that strange, ethereal quality that seemed to defy natural law. Even Spot, usually suspicious of unfamiliar horses, sat calmly watching the display. "The Spanish bloodline we traced in Thunder," Harrison continued, his voice filled with dawning comprehension. "It wasn't just about pedigree, was it? Somehow, he's connected to something much older, something we barely understand." Thunder nickered softly, touching his nose to John's shoulder in a gesture of trust and affection. The mare watched this interaction with what seemed like approval, her intelligent eyes reflecting understanding that went beyond animal instinct. "Your wife," Harrison said, turning to John with new respect. "She wasn't just photographing horses, was she? She was protecting them, keeping their secrets safe." He looked down at the ownership papers in his hand, then back at the magnificent display before him. "These documents, they're meaningless here, aren't they?" John nodded slowly, feeling a deep connection to Sarah's work that he'd never fully appreciated before. All those times, she'd tried to explain the importance of what she was documenting, all the hours she'd spent tracking the herd through the mountains. It hadn't just been about photography. She had been a guardian herself, protecting something precious and mysterious from the modern world's tendency to capture, classify, and control. The wild horses began to slow their circular movement, coming to a graceful stop with the mare at their head. She stood proud and free, a living embodiment of the ancient spirit that still roamed these mountains. Thunder looked between her and John, his own role in this extraordinary drama becoming clearer with each passing moment. The morning air grew warmer as the sun climbed higher, melting the frost on the grass and creating a mystical mist that swirled around the gathered horses. Harrison carefully returned his documents to his briefcase, his movements deliberate and thoughtful. "All these years," he mused, "we've been approaching this all wrong. We thought we were dealing with exceptional breeding, with genetics that could be captured and replicated, but this," he gestured to the scene before them, "this is something else entirely." The wild mare stepped forward again, her movements carrying a grace that seemed almost supernatural. She approached Harrison directly, stopping just a few feet away. The businessman stood perfectly still as she regarded him with those ancient, knowing eyes. "I remember reading Sarah's notes about these horses," Harrison said softly, careful not to move. "She wrote about their ability to choose their own path, about how they weren't meant to be owned or controlled. At the time, I dismissed it as romantic nonsense, but she was right, wasn't she?" John nodded, watching as Thunder moved to stand beside the mare. Together they created a striking picture. The black stallion and the wild mare, representatives of two worlds that were perhaps not so separate after all. "Sarah spent years trying to understand them," John explained, his voice thick with emotion. "She would tell me about how they seemed to appear and disappear at will, how they moved through the mountains like shadows. She believed they were protecting something, not just territory but knowledge, wisdom, something older than our understanding." Thunder turned to look at John, his intelligent eyes seeming to convey volumes. All those nights spent in the stable, all those moments when John had sensed something different about this horse, everything was falling into place. "The Spanish bloodline we traced," Harrison said, pulling out one last document. "It goes back centuries to horses that were said to have escaped during the early explorations of these mountains. Local legends say they merged with something that was already here, something ancient and powerful." He looked up at the wild herd with new understanding. "We thought we were preserving a pure bloodline, but we were actually interfering with something far more important." The wild horses had arranged themselves in a semicircle, creating a natural amphitheater around the humans and the two horses at its center. Their presence seemed to charge the air with energy, making even the most skeptical of Harrison's men shift uncomfortably. "Look at how they move together," John observed, gesturing to the herd. "It's not just instinct or training. They're connected in a way we can barely comprehend. All these months, Thunder has been trying to show me this, but I wasn't ready to see it." The mare touched her nose to Thunder's neck, and a visible shiver ran through the black stallion's body. It was as if something was awakening within him, something that had been dormant during his time in captivity. "The indigenous people have a name for them," Harrison said, consulting his notes one last time. "They call them spirit keepers, horses that guard the balance between the natural and supernatural worlds. We thought it was just a story, but..." He gestured to the scene before them. "How much of our world's magic have we lost by dismissing such stories as mere legends?" Thunder stepped forward, placing himself between John and the wild herd. His posture was proud but gentle, communicating something important. He looked at John with those intelligent eyes, then back at the herd, then at John again. The message was clear. He was not asking for permission to leave, nor was he bidding farewell. Instead, he seemed to be offering something else. An understanding that freedom and loyalty could coexist, that love didn't always mean possession. Harrison stood for a long moment, looking between the legal documents in his hands and the extraordinary scene before him. Finally, with a decisive gesture, he tore the ownership papers in half. "Some things aren't meant to be owned," he said quietly. "Your wife understood that, Mr. Matthews. She tried to tell us all, but we weren't ready to listen." He turned to his men, who was still watching the wild herd with a mixture of awe and unease. "Pack up the equipment. We're leaving." The wild mare nickered softly, as if acknowledging Harrison's decision. The rest of the herd remained in their perfect formation, their presence creating an almost tangible energy in the morning air. John stepped forward, placing his hand on Thunder's neck one last time. "I understand now," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "All those nights you spent looking towards the forest, all those times you seemed to be waiting for something. You were never really lost, were you?" Thunder's intelligent eyes met John's, conveying a depth of understanding that transcended the usual boundaries between human and animal. The stallion pressed his forehead against John's chest in a gesture of affection and trust. "Mr. Matthews," Harrison said, gathering his remaining papers, "there's something else you should know. Those photographs your wife took, they were more important than anyone realized. She wasn't just documenting the horses, she was protecting them. There were others looking for them, people who wouldn't have understood or respected what they represent." John remembered Sarah's determination to keep her most revealing photographs private, how she would spend hours organizing and hiding her notes. "She knew," he said softly. "She knew they were special, that they needed to be protected." The wild mare stepped closer, touching her nose to Thunder's flank. The gesture seemed to carry meaning beyond simple animal communication. It was an invitation, a welcome, a recognition of belonging. Harrison watched this interaction with visible emotion. "In all my years working with horses, I've never seen anything like this. These creatures, they're not just animals, they're guardians of something precious, something we've nearly forgotten in our modern world." Thunder moved gracefully between John and the wild herd, his movements suggesting not a farewell, but a promise. He looked at John with those knowing eyes, then back at the herd, as if trying to communicate something important. "I think I understand," John said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're not choosing between us, are you? You're showing us that there's another way." He turned to Harrison. "Sarah used to say that love isn't about possession, it's about understanding and respect." The morning sun had risen fully now, casting long shadows across the snow-covered ground. The wild horses began to move, their hooves creating intricate patterns in the fresh snow. It was like watching a dance that had been performed for centuries, a ritual that spoke of freedom, wisdom, and the enduring magic of the natural world. Thunder remained where he was, a bridge between two worlds. His presence seemed to embody everything Sarah had tried to protect, the mystery, the freedom, and the ancient wisdom that still existed in these mountains, if only one knew where to look. Harrison pulled one last item from his briefcase, a worn photograph that had clearly been handled many times. "Your wife gave me this years ago," he said, handing it to John. "She told me I'd understand its importance someday. I think that day has finally come." John held the photograph with trembling hands. It showed a younger Sarah standing in this very valley, surrounded by the wild horses. The mare was there, looking exactly as she did now, and beside her stood a black stallion that could have been Thunder's twin. The resemblance was uncanny, down to the distinctive white marking on the leg. "She never told me about this," John said softly, studying the image. "All those times she went out with her camera, all those hours spent in the mountains. She was protecting them, wasn't she?" Harrison nodded. Sarah was part of a small group of people who understood what these horses represented. She knew they needed to be protected, not just from those who would capture them, but from a world that had forgotten the importance of mystery and magic. The wild mare approached John, her movement drawing his attention from the photograph. As he looked into her eyes, he saw the same ancient wisdom that Sarah had captured in her images. For the first time, he truly understood what his wife had been trying to preserve all those years ago. Thunder stepped forward, pressing his nose against the photograph in John's hands. The gesture seemed deliberate, meaningful. John looked closer at the image and noticed something he hadn't seen before. In the background, barely visible among the trees, were more horses, their forms shadowy and ethereal. "The bloodline we were tracking," Harrison said, "it wasn't just about genetics. These horses, they're connected to something older than our records, older than our understanding." Sarah knew that trying to possess them, to control them, would destroy the very thing that makes them special. The wild herd began to move again, creating concentric circles around Thunder and the mare. Their movements were synchronized, almost ritualistic, as if they were performing an ancient ceremony. The morning mist swirled around their hooves, adding to the mystical atmosphere. "Look at how they move," Harrison observed, his voice filled with wonder. "It's like they're dancing to music only they can hear. In all my years working with horses, I've never seen anything like this." John watched as Thunder joined the dance, his movements perfectly matched to those of the wild herd. Yet every few circles, he would return to where John stood, touching his nose to John's hand before rejoining the flowing movement of the herd. "He's not saying goodbye," John realized aloud. "He's showing us that there's no need for goodbyes. These mountains, these horses, they're part of something bigger than ownership or possession." The morning sun had risen higher, and its rays caught the frost on the horses' coats, creating an almost supernatural shimmer. The wild mare stepped out of the dance to stand beside Thunder, and together they approached John one last time. Sarah always said that true love means knowing when to hold on and when to let go, John said, reaching out to touch both horses. But sometimes letting go doesn't mean losing something. It means becoming part of something greater. Thunder's eyes met John's, and in that moment a deeper understanding passed between them. The horse wasn't choosing between captivity and freedom, between domestication and wildness. He was showing that there was another way, a path where love and freedom could coexist, where bonds could transcend the usual boundaries between human and animal. The photograph in John's hands seemed to pulse with new meaning. Sarah hadn't just been documenting these creatures. She had been preserving the knowledge of something miraculous, something that defied the modern world's need to categorize and control. Her legacy wasn't just in the images she'd captured, but in the wisdom she'd tried to share about the true nature of love and freedom. As spring bloomed in the valley, John's farm underwent a transformation. The stable doors remained open, allowing Thunder to come and go as he pleased. Sometimes he would disappear for days, running with the wild herd through the mountains, but he would always return, bringing with him the spirit of freedom that Sarah had sought to protect. Harrison kept his word. Not only did he destroy all documentation claiming ownership of Thunder, but he also became an advocate for protecting the mysterious horses of the mountains. His influence in the equestrian world was instrumental in keeping their secrets safe, ensuring that the ancient magic of these creatures remained undisturbed. One particularly beautiful autumn evening, as the setting sun painted the sky in shades of gold and purple, John sat on his porch watching a remarkable scene unfold. Thunder and the wild herd had gathered in the valley below, moving in their mesmerizing circular dance. Their coats shimmered with that otherworldly quality that still took his breath away, even after all these months. "You were right, Sarah," he whispered to the evening air. "Some things aren't meant to be owned. Some things are meant to be witnessed, protected, and set free." The photograph she had taken years ago now held a place of honor in his home, a reminder of the wisdom she had tried to share with the world. The wild mare appeared at the edge of his property, Thunder by her side. Together, they approached the porch where John sat. Their presence carried the same magical quality it had on that first morning when everything changed. Thunder pressed his forehead against John's chest, a gesture that had become their way of communicating something deeper than words could express. Behind them, the rest of the herd continued their dance, their movements creating patterns in the tall grass. John had learned to recognize this ritual. It wasn't just a display of joy or freedom. but a celebration of the balance between the wild and the tame, between mystery and understanding. As the light faded and the first stars appeared in the evening sky, Thunder and the mare rejoined the herd. But before they disappeared into the gathering dusk, Thunder turned back one last time, his powerful form silhouetted against the sunset. His eyes met John's across the distance, carrying the same message they always did. A reminder that love doesn't mean possession, that freedom and loyalty could coexist in perfect harmony. The wild horses vanished into the forest, their forms merging with the shadows, but John knew they weren't truly gone. They were part of these mountains, guardians of ancient wisdom that Sarah had understood and fought to protect. Thunder would return, as he always did, bringing with him the magic of two worlds united. In the end, John realized that this wasn't just a story about a man and a horse. It was about understanding that the most precious things in life couldn't be owned or contained. It was about learning to love freely, to protect fiercely, and to find joy in being part of something greater than oneself. As the last light faded from the sky, John could almost hear Sarah's voice in the evening breeze, sharing the wisdom she had tried to teach him all those years ago. True love means knowing when to hold on and when to let go. And sometimes, in the letting go, we find something even more beautiful than what we thought we wanted to keep. The mountains kept their secrets. The wild horses danced their ancient dance, and in the space between freedom and belonging, Thunder had shown them all that some bonds transcend the boundaries humans try to create. The magic Sarah had sought to protect lived on, not just in photographs or memories, but in the continuing dance of hooves across the valley, in the whisper of wind through the trees, and in the enduring spirit of horses that belong to no one and everyone. Dear listeners, we hope the tale of John and Thunder has touched your hearts as deeply as it touched ours. This story reminds us that sometimes the most powerful bonds are formed not through possession, but through understanding and respect. If you've been moved by this journey of love, freedom, and ancient magic, we invite you to join our community of storytellers and dreamers. Click the subscribe button to your left to ensure you never miss our daily stories that explore the extraordinary mysteries of life. Don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear what this story meant to you. Our next tale awaits, ready to transport you to another world of wonder and discovery. Until then, may you find the magic in your own story.